Hello there. I'm Eleanor Krasin-Kovan, Editor-in-Chief of Healthcare for Women International. I'm also Professor Emerita of Gerontology at University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And I'm here with Elizabeth Fugate Whitlock.
Hello, I am the Managing Editor for Healthcare for Women International and a lecturer of gerontology at UNCW.
We're here to present for you a workshop on tips for publishing success. Technology is really great. We can do this in absentia, and you can watch this workshop while you're attending the International Congress on Women's Health Issues. This workshop will be available to you during the days of the Congress, and if you have any questions about it and you email either me or Elizabeth, we will answer your questions during the Congress. So I hope that you listen carefully at your own convenience. You can start and stop this and get out of it what you wish. I've been an editor of this journal for a really long time, and I want you to consider this workshop, if nothing else, a pep talk. An awful lot of people who have attended my workshops really need a different kind of tip for publishing success. They need a kick in the butt, and they need a cheerleader to go, rah, 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 vis boom ba, you can do this, ha, ha, ha. And you can. Writing for publication really is your chance to take your place in the world of science. You need to grasp opportunities to make a difference. Most of you, not most of you, but many of you may think of the need to publish as just something that you have to do, some box that you have to check for your annual review. But I actually think as an editor that publishing is important. So I want you to discover your passion, realize that you have a lot to contribute to the world of science, and write something that turns you on, that you think other people need to know. You're going to utilize lessons that you've had from mentors, from people who have taught you, but you're also, if you're going to do a good job, you're going to utilize your own inner wisdom. You're going to remember what turned you on to being a scientist or a practitioner in the first place. The best manuscripts are actually manuscripts that literally turn you back into what turned you on in the first place. If you look at the last thing that's on this slide, it says engage in continuous comparative analysis. Well, that's a reflection back to my own mentors. I'm a grounded theorist, and I learned what I know about editing and about understanding the world around me from a process of grounded theory that involves continuous comparative analysis. If you're going to do a good job on your manuscript, regardless of where you place it for publication, it's going to be because you've taken the time to really do research into the variety of publications that are out there for you to choose. You're going to have to choose where to publish your work, and the best manuscripts, when to do the choosing, is way before you've begun to write.
So we're going to go over a few tips that are both specific to our journal and the work we do, but are also things that we believe will help you in a broader sense that you can apply to other journals and maybe other avenues for publication. While we think we're a fantastic journal, we know there are lots of other great journals out there too. So I guess where we want to start is our first tip is knowing the aims of the editor. And our advice would be really to choose your journal wisely. Don't blindly submit just because submitting online is easy. Really take a hard look at the aims of the specific journal and how you can contribute and how you fit. Make sure your work fits before you submit it. It'll save you a lot of time and heartache, and frankly us a lot of time and heartache as well. So Ellie's going to talk a bit on the next couple slides about this continuous comparative analysis that she mentioned, and we're going to look at a few other journals as well as ours.
Now, looking at a variety of journals is really, really important, and the first place to look is at the mission statements. All journals today have websites. All journals, regardless of whether, of how they ask you to submit, describe what they want on their websites. And, this is an International Women's Health Conference, so that we chose a series of journals that we think might reflect at least some of you in the audience. So those of you who are familiar with maternal child health are probably familiar with MCN. And you can read along with me that MCN's mission is to provide the most timely, relevant information to nurses who practice in perinatal, neonatal, midwifery, and pediatric specialties. Right away, you know in the very first sentence that they're targeting nurses. Their audience is nurses, and the manuscripts they expect to get are about nursing practice. And if you keep reading, it says they publish critically relevant information as well as research aimed at assisting nurses toward evidence-based practice. It's about practice. They don't want a theoretical manuscript. They want a practice manuscript with real evidence that the practice that you're writing about makes a difference. They focus on major issues and high priority problems in maternal child nursing, women's health, and family nursing. But their mission statement is very specific. It's specific to one discipline. We don't know, just from reading that, whether they're targeting an international audience or not, so you have to read further. But right away, you can see that that mission statement is quite specific. If you're in maternal child nursing, they might be a much more appropriate journal for you than Healthcare for Women International.
And Ellie mentioned that the profession was obvious from the mission statement, but maybe the geographic aim wasn't. So our suggestion to you would be to first take a look at some of their recent published work and see where those particular studies took place. If you can't get a clue from that, then go on and ask the editor. But really, you can learn a lot of information about a journal based on what they've published. So we suggest you start there.
Mm-hmm. In our second example, we present violence against women, and they also use an acronym VAW. And it's a peer-reviewed journal as well. It's published every single month, and they tell you it's international and interdisciplinary, and that they're dedicated to the publication of research and information on all aspects of the problem of violence, and violence against women in particular. It's very broad. We know that it's international, but we know that the topic, while all aspects of violence are pretty broad, it's still about one specific item, one specific healthcare issue for women, very important one. And if you are interested in addressing other scholars or other people who are working in the field of violence, and you are not particularly interested in addressing economists or anthropologists, this might be the right journal for you. Choosing a journal is very, very important, and you really want to publish your work in a journal where it'll have the greatest impact.
And keep in mind when I mentioned looking at recent previous publications, that while this particular journal focuses on violence as their main focus, that's what they do, a journal like ours, Healthcare for Women International, we typically publish at least one thematic issue on violence per year because we see lots of papers. I'm sure you could find examples even in maternal child nursing about, for example, women that have been abused and their experiences given birth, and maybe as a nurse how you would interact with them. So it's not limiting, but this is sort of helping clue you in. Hey, I'm writing about violence. This is a good place to start.
I always also tell people that you should look at the references in the articles that are written in that journal, and look for an article that you like in particular and the references there to give you other clues for what other websites of other journals you should look at to see where your work would have the best fit. If a particular article published in a journal has turned you on, chances are that's a good journal for you to start with. I want to say one more thing about journal mission statements and about editors, because this is a tip about knowing what an editor thinks. Editors like to think that the people who are submitting work to their journal actually read their journal. So when you're looking at references, you should always perhaps reference something that has been published in a journal where you're submitting your work. If you haven't read that journal or haven't seen something published in that journal that is important to you, it may not be the right journal for your work. Now, if you're a new scholar, of course that's an exception. Then any journal might be the right journal for you. You just have to pick the one that turns you on.
And that's a great tip, because as managing editor, I look at all submissions first. And one of the things I often look for, if it's a topic I know we've published a lot about, have they referenced any of our work? Are they familiar with our work? Did they take a few minutes, because that's really all it takes,
Yes.
to see what we've done? That helps me know maybe that it's a better fit for our journal.
Okay, so now we move with our journal being the example, and you will read, what's on the slide is just what you would find if you went to our website and looked at our mission statement. We are a critically acclaimed international publication. We think we provide a unique interdisciplinary approach to healthcare and related topics that concern women around the globe. And when we say that concern women around the globe, we are trying to reach as broad an audience as possible. So we try to have manuscripts that represent the entire earth at some point in time in the course of a year. We're published monthly, as was Violence Against Women, and we try to include the newest research, theories, and issues in the fields of public health, social science, healthcare practice, healthcare policy, and many, many other disciplines. Scholars and practitioners are both publishing in our journal, so we look at articles of practice as well as the issues of healthcare policy. So it's much broader than the other two journals that I've given you examples of. There are other journals that are as broad as ours as well. There's another journal called Women in Health of which there's some overlap to ours. But I would argue that we have probably the broadest journal out there with regard to disciplinary research, and the fact that we focus on both healthcare practice and healthcare policy and theoretical articles. So I think you'll find that, and you'll see that violence appears again in our line, and you'll also see that we include a host of other gender-based issues. I really like to encourage discussion topics, and I invite readers all the time to comment about articles that focus on specific aspects of health. I don't get enough of those, enough discussion back in our journal, but we'll talk more about that later.
And I guess the last thing I want to say when we're thinking about missions, you've noticed in our mission statement as well as the Violence Journal's mission statement, we mentioned that we publish 12 times a year, publish monthly. Well, why does that matter? It matters because we probably publish more articles than a journal that, say, only publishes quarterly. So that may be something you consider when you're submitting work. How quickly do you need to get something published? Because the truth is, we often publish based on deadlines of academic requirements going up for reappointment, promotion, and tenure, for example. So looking to see how many articles are typically published in a year won't guarantee you publication, certainly, but will help you sort of gauge your chances of being published and the speed with which you're published. So we have just a few, we've listed 3 of our particular aims for our journal, and we'll talk more a little bit about all of them, but the first is to stimulate an international multidisciplinary dialogue on women's health issues. I knew that was going to happen.
Just pause it. It's okay.
So when talking about our journal, we have a few specific aims that we're going to sort of give an overview of here and then talk more in depth a bit later. But the first is to stimulate an international multidisciplinary dialogue on women's health issues. The second would be to publish evidence-based research, or translational knowledge if you prefer that term, on healthcare and related topics that concern women around the globe. And then the third is to empower authors who consider cultural differences, alternative lifestyles, domestic violence, public health issues, the aging of the population, maternal morbidity and mortality, infectious disease, treatment regimens, caregiving, and a host of other gender-based ethical issues. So you see, we'll cover quite a lot in our journal. So you notice we said in that last slide that one of the things we want to do is to stimulate dialogue. And Ellie mentioned early on that she really hoped that we would have more of these sort of letters to the editor style contributions. So she's going to talk a bit more about how to stimulate dialogue.
Yeah, writing letters to the editor is a really important place to begin. Perhaps you're not ready because you're too nervous. It scares it just scares the heck out of you, and you're not ready to write an article and you don't have much time. But you read an article that you really liked, and it meant so much to you that you were thinking about it when you went to sleep. Well, a very good thing to do if you're thinking about it that much is to sit down in front of your computer and write something about it, and write some comment. If something turns you on that much, you either really didn't like it, or you liked it a whole lot, or something about that research study that you just read sparked curiosity in you about whether you could do something similar in your own social world. Writing a letter to the editor is really important because it does create diverse points of view, and it does create dialogue. And the reason I like to be an editor is that I really want to stimulate information. I want to stimulate dialogue because you've learned something. So it's an easier way to get published. While it doesn't count the same on an annual productivity report as peer-reviewed research, it will help you. And and that's important. Sometimes for young researchers, it's the best way to go.
So our second tip is to always consider your audience. And that was one of the things we had you first look at in terms of mission statements.
When it comes to publishing, we tell people audience, audience, audience. In our country, realtors always say the most important thing you need to know about their business is location, location, location. Well, in my business, in the business of publishing journals, audience, audience, audience is what you need to consider. You need to consider it before you write a paper. You need to consider it when you're choosing a journal. You need to consider it when you're writing the background statement for your work, and you need to consider it again when you're writing your conclusions and your discussion. You are writing for a particular audience, and what are you doing it for other than getting a line on your Vita? Hopefully to teach people something. So who are you going to teach? What are you going to teach them? And why should they want to know? Should be on your mind for every paragraph you write.
So some of the things just in general to keep in mind for challenges based on that audience is English is not everyone's native language. Another is that our audience does not share one set of theoretical assumptions, a unique methodological approach, or a common scope of practice. And culture makes a difference in prioritizing healthcare issues among women. I tell our authors a lot. It's usually one of the first and biggest things that papers get dinged on is this international appeal. What is it that your work how can it be translated to other practitioners, other researchers, other scholars, and how can they use it going forward? And it can feel really difficult, and it can feel like you have more sort of mountains or hills to climb in terms of writing for us, but at the end of the day, it makes for a stronger paper, and it makes your contribution larger.
And how do you do this? How do you make an international appeal? It's not something that is necessarily intuitive to everyone. We're not asking you to create, for those of you who are into quantitative research terms, we're not asking you to create an ecological fallacy, generalizing your work from one particular city and one particular country to the entire world. But we're asking you to raise the findings in your argument to a higher level of theoretical abstraction. What is it that you're trying to say? If you find in your neck of the woods, which is an English idiom, if you find in your locale that there's a relationship between where a health facility is located and who attends the health facility, is that something that's likely to be similar in other countries or different in other countries? It's likely to matter in some way, shape, or form everywhere, but think about why it matters when you're writing your findings. That's how you make an international appeal.
And I will say, making that international appeal, for example, if you're writing about breast cancer and your particular study was done in Canada, say, it's not enough to just say people in all countries all over the world get breast cancer. That's not enough. That doesn't do the trick. It might be a starting point, but that's not enough. It's really that higher level of abstraction that Ellie mentioned. So the other piece of our audience is that they're interdisciplinary. And you'll see we list just some examples here of what our interdisciplinary audience looks like, or fields they represent. And it's that understanding each other's work piece and making sure other people understand it.
So what does it mean for you as an author who's writing for an interdisciplinary audience? Well, it probably means you have to not use a lot of jargon that would be understood only in your particular discipline. I mean, let's talk about just one set of words that came up before. I mean, some people talk about evidence-based practice, and other people use
Translational knowledge.
yes. And if you're using just one of those terms and not the other, people from other disciplines might not know what you're writing about. So it's important to try to use language that explains to people what you're trying to do. I prefer evidence-based practice simply because I understand those words. And when somebody says translational knowledge, I keep thinking, are they translating, from Spanish to French to English? And so you have to choose language that you think people are going to understand in other disciplines. Every discipline has specific jargon. You want to try to avoid that jargon as often as possible. And it matters not just in terms of your discipline. You have to consider this in every single section of your manuscript. People who go to particular schools and study a particular research methodology are usually so versed in it that they use the words that their mentors taught them in their manuscripts. But if you're writing about phenomenology or grounded theory or transactional analysis, and you're using the jargon from any of those particular methodologies, people who have not been schooled in those methodologies are not going to understand the words. So you have to sometimes write a little more in a methods section for our journal than you would if you were publishing in a journal that catered to the audience that's specific to the methodology you use.
And I think another way the audience matters would be, other than the method section, would be your discussion. For example, I'm a social worker by profession, so if I wrote a paper and submitted it to our journal, and I wrote only about how social workers could take my work and apply it and what good they could do with it, I'm really narrowing the field. I think it's a challenge, just like the international appeal is, but I think oftentimes if we sort of step out of our box, our discipline-specific box, we can see that social workers could also influence nurses and could influence community health practitioners, and that we could learn from one another, and there are pieces that can apply to other disciplines, and it's just important to remember that bigger picture in your discussion.
And that's absolutely the case, because around the globe, disciplines don't even have identical boundaries. I remember working with faculties of nursing in Thailand, for example, and the first time I was at Khon Kaen University, I was really surprised to learn that a lot of the things that the nursing faculty do were identical to things that social work faculty did on my own campus. It wasn't that there wasn't anybody on Khon Kaen campus who practiced social work. It was that there was a much hazier line between the two disciplines, because nursing faculty do a lot more work in communities than many nursing faculty do in our country.
So our third tip is do explain, don't assume.
It really matters in our journal, but it'll matter in other journals as well. We're asking you to explain epistemology. How do you know what you know? If you assume everybody's going to know because you told them you did phenomenology, you're going to assume wrong. Don't refer to a method only by name. Don't assume that all understand statistics. Everyone doesn't understand statistics. That's why we have to have many different reviewers in our journal, to make sure we get reviewers who understand the methods that you use. But you need to explain them, and explain why those methods are chosen to an audience who doesn't use your methods. And you have to discuss the implications of statistical results. Don't assume all understand axial coding if you're a grounded theorist. Everyone doesn't know what that term means, yet alone what it meant to you in your study. And suggestions for future research probably belong in just about every manuscript. I don't think anyone who's published in our journal has yet come up with the definitive answer for all women's health issues, yet alone any one particular one. So most manuscripts should include suggestions for future research and not end their manuscript as if their work is the end of all studies. Do say how your work contributes to research that's already there and what research is needed in the future to move us forward.
So just like with that last slide, we have some tips for appealing to an international audience. You have to explain how things work in your country. And don't assume everyone knows about your country, for example. Use culturally universal terms when possible. Ellie mentioned several times, don't use jargon. If you're going to use it, you need to explain it. I know I get journal articles all the time and there's something in the abstract that I have no idea what it is, and I have to quickly go out and do my own little research before it can progress on because it's a word or a term I've never heard in my social work or gerontology life. Do collaborate with others if you have issues writing in English, if it's not what you speak, your first language. Hire an editor. Don't assume that we'll do it. It's a turnoff to a lot of reviewers. There may be things that I feel like are minor, but if I send out to a reviewer, they may think, gosh, if these basic English issues aren't quite right, then they're not going to have the research right. It's just a polish issue.
And this matters a lot. I can actually say, and I know I'm correct, that as a journal editor, I'm more lenient with grammatical errors than are many other journal editors. But you know, it's getting tougher and tougher to get published in any journal. And if you are from another country and your first language is something other than English, you probably should budget somewhere along the line, either finding a friend or a colleague whose native language is English, or figuring out that you're probably going to have to pay for the services of an editor. Editors are out there. Taylor and Francis as a publishing house can help you find someone to do it, but there is a cost for it.
I would say check with your mentors as well. They may have resources. A lot of campuses, as we're required to publish, have writing circles, and maybe going to those writing circles and working with your peers will help in that regard as well. And finally, it's a big one for us.
Elizabeth, I found a typo. I made it.
Discursion.
Yes.
Yes.
I made it. So, I'm putting it in here because I think it's important in a workshop for tips for publishing success. I promise you I didn't do this on purpose. But proofread. Your work won't be rejected if you spell the word discussion wrong and you type discursion. But you should be proofreading enough times that this happens a minimal number of times in your manuscript. But even editors make mistakes.
Yes. And managing editors, because I read it too and didn't catch it. Which probably shows why it pays to pay someone. Ellie and I work so closely and we know what we're going to say about the journal and what we're talking about, so it's probably more likely we'd miss each other's mistakes than a third party who knew nothing about our journal.
And this was something we added to our presentation almost at the last minute, and and I just didn't want it to be missed. When we tell you to appeal to an international audience, and we require you in your introductory paragraph to do that, we want you to take it through the entire manuscript. I want you to think about that audience as you write every section, and you should at least come back to the audience in your discussion section, because you are telling a group of people who are practitioners and scholars why they should be interested in your study. And in terms of the global picture, it's a small study. Everybody's study is relatively small. So you're telling this audience of readers why they should care and what they can learn. And then in the discussion, you're reminding them, well, you just told them all this stuff. This is what they can do with it. You're telling them what the takeaway is, and the takeaway should be audience specific, not the audience. If your audience is policymakers in your own country, then you're probably publishing in a journal that's specific to your own country. If you're publishing in an international interdisciplinary journal like Healthcare for Women International, you're going to have to address that audience in your discussion, discursively.
So it's also important to know how your work is evaluated for that specific journal. A lot of times you'll find information on the tips for authors or on the instructions for authors webpage. But we think in general there's 3 ways your work is evaluated by most journals. The first is methods, the second is adequacy of references, and the third is style.
Absolutely. And usually the evaluation begins with style. If you submit your work in the style of a totally different journal, you're not likely to get accepted. You're definitely going to be rejected on the first go around. This takes minimal effort on your part, but usually the first thing that an editor looks at, or the managing editor looks at, is your abstract. Because in your abstract you tell people, what it is your study or your practice is about. Well, in our journal we use pretty much APA format. If you write an abstract in a different format, where you write hypothesis, sample, and you separate it by colons rather than writing a whole paragraph about what your study is about, your work is not in the style of our journal, and moreover, you're telling us you didn't even look at the style of our journal, so why should we look at your work?
And truthfully, we probably don't keep reading the work, and I would say most editors don't. We get so many papers, it just can't happen.
So look first and write the right kind of abstract, and put your manuscript in the style of the journal to which you're submitting. And look really carefully. You might be trying to publish the same study and in 3 different journals sequentially. I hope you don't violate the rules of science and submit the same work to 3 different places at the same time. But before you go from one journal to another, you're probably going to have to edit the manuscript for style, because we're all a little bit different. Take the time to do it and consider it an exercise, literally, just an exercise of putting things on paper. You've all filled out applications for school, applications for employment, and the first element said name. But I'll bet you those applications differed in the course of your lifetime. Some asked you to put your surname first, some asked you to put your first name first. Some didn't ask for first name or surname at all, they asked for something called given name. Look at it, read it, and make sure you prepare your work in the style that the editor is asking you to do it, because if you don't, it won't be read. We're just too busy to sift through it. And, so you need to take the time.
And I won't spend much talking to you about the difference between how qualitative and quantitative work, for example, is evaluated. There are tons of great checklists available. I know one we like to use for quantitative work is by Yamarino. I'm sure you can find it, Google it. But we will say, we've talked a bit about references already. We think it's important that we see some evidence in your references that you've looked at our journal's work, our scope of work, and you've referred to it. But also in terms of adequacy and that audience piece, we're talking as well about the age of papers, the age of references you use. Some disciplines have sort of a hard and fast rule that if something hasn't been published or said in the past 3 or 5 years, it's out of date, we don't want to hear about it, it's not important. Our journal, for example, because we're interdisciplinary, doesn't have that viewpoint. So it's something really to be aware of. If you submit something that has a real theoretical underpinning and you're only talking about work in the past 3 years, you're really ignoring a whole bunch of knowledge that's probably important.
And I want to add something to that. You see this gray hair? I earned it. I've lived in the world of science and the world of research since 1970. I find that as an editor, that particular policy that some mentors teach their students of looking only at work published in the past 3 years, disgusting. I'll even say the word that strongly. Disgusting. Because if you're only looking at work published in the past 3 years, you may think you're inventing the wheel. When the wheel that you have just designed was invented 40 or 50 years ago, you just didn't look because you were told to only look for 3 years. You're going to miss a lot. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have a literature review that goes back to the Stone Age. It just means that there is no hard, fast rule on how old literature should be for Healthcare for Women International. Another editor may be just like the person who told you, only look at work for 3 years. This goes back to understand the style of the journal, understand what a particular editor wants, and give it to the particular editor. Don't give the editor what he or she doesn't want, certainly without asking him or her first.
So if you've looked at our website, you'll see that not only are we an international journal in terms of our scope and our name, but our editorial board is international. It's something that we're quite proud of. Our reviewer board is quite large, is quite international as well. So while we understand that there may be some issues with English writing or English proficiency, our editorial board will not and cannot copy edit your manuscript.
If you're very lucky, you might get a reviewer who will do a little of that. But as a general rule, don't expect us to do it. It will delay your publication. You will certainly get published a lot sooner if you invest in the services of a professional editor.
So our fourth tip is to follow the stylistic norms.
We've already covered a lot of those, but it's an important one. We can't say it often enough. You know, every single journal that exists can be analyzed. You can compare the articles that are published in it to see what are the norms for that particular journal, the norms for references, the norms for for section headings. I mean, one of the things that we don't do in our journal is encourage authors to use the very first heading of their article, introduction. I mean, we want you to write an introductory paragraph. That is not what most people think of when they say introduction. What most people think of when they say introduction is what we call background. What should people know in order to understand your work? So look at the journal, look at the headings that previous authors have used, and make sure that yours can conform to that. You need to do that regardless of what journal you're doing. They're little things, but if you follow the pattern of all those articles that have been published previous to yours, you are much more likely to get accepted. And the opposite is also true. If you don't, you're taking a direct path to rejection. And people ask me, golly, is style more important than content? And the answer is no, it's not. But it gets you in the door. You know, I mean, think about finding employment in a particular university. The candidate that dresses like most people who are on the faculty has a much better chance than the candidate who dresses totally differently and who looks to the existing faculty like they just got off an alien spaceship. That's what I'm trying to say. Look like you fit. You can be a little odd, but not so odd that you don't fit the mold.
So for the next few slides, we are going to talk about some of our specific stylistic norms and something we've said before, but I can't stress enough that these things that we expect are standards. If they're not met, your work is going to be rejected out of hand. In other words, we're not going to comment at all on content. We're not going to give you feedback on content because we just don't feel like it's beneficial. The work needs to meet our standards to move on. So Ellie's going to talk about the first, and it's a biggie for us.
Yeah, anthropomorphism. It's a long word. Most people can't even pronounce it correctly, and sometimes I'm one of those who pronounces it wrong. But we have a long history of rejecting anthropomorphism. So what is anthropomorphism? Anthropomorphism involves using, human terms to things that are inanimate. So the editor of Healthcare for Women International prior to me was Phyllis Stern, who was a dear friend of mine. And she really hated when people said, studies show us that this, that, or the other thing is the way to go. Phyllis was the champion of cheerleaders. Phyllis wanted authors to realize how important they were. So she made the rule that it was against the editorial policy of the journal to allow for anthropomorphism. And I happen to agree with her wholeheartedly. If you had an aim when you decided to do a study, or you decided to initiate a new practice in the hospital where you or your students are working, then by golly, own it. You did something. You came up with something new. You came up with the design of the study. You don't have to say the study said this or that. The study didn't say anything. You did a study. You designed it. You had results. You produced results. You concluded. You analyzed. So say it. If you really don't want to write in first person, we'll talk about that later, you could say the aims of the researchers were. But if you're the researcher, by golly, say there's nothing wrong with saying you did this, I did this, and I did this because. So don't tell me the study aims to explain. The study doesn't aim to explain anything. You aim to do a study, and based on the study you did, you are suggesting. Your data suggests nothing. Your analysis of the data allow you to suggest something. Use those words when you write for my journal. Now, if you're writing for a different journal, then don't write that way if your continuous comparative analysis shows you that everything else published in that journal is anthropomorphic. But this is a big one for me. This matters because I think because our journal is a feminist journal, and so often women haven't been given the opportunity to take their place in the world of science. It's okay to say, I have done, we have done.
Which leads us right into our next norm, and that's using first person. There's nothing wrong, we believe, with using first person subjects in your writing. It's consistent with APA, which a lot of people don't think is the case, but it is. It's that notion of taking credit. There's nothing wrong with it. And just like the anthropomorphism, it's a super easy thing for you to edit in or out of a paper depending on where you publish it. Takes minimal time, and it could be the difference in getting in the door or having the door shut on you.
We're so hot on this issue that it takes us minimal time. If we're honest, we'll say, for reasons that are unfathomable to us, authors seem to struggle with this. But we're basically telling you that research in and of itself doesn't exist. I mean, and until we really invent, a robot that can think and study and record things, studies don't show us. And even then, you would write, the robot showed us.
So our next is that introductory paragraph, and it's one we've mentioned at several points. The short answer for this is tell the reader what you did, why you did it, and what can be learned by our international interdisciplinary audience. What makes your work important and fit? We expect that paragraph, when we say introductory paragraph, we mean we want to see it front and center. It is different from sort of that background piece that Ellie mentioned. I think of it often as setting the stage. I know when I teach writing a lit review, we sort of talk about this funnel approach, and that's often what your background does, where it talks about previous work and then brings you right into the purpose. But we want to see in that very first paragraph, I'm sure it's some marketing norm that you've got to just grab the reader immediately. But we find it works. It helps us. It helps set the stage as far as we're concerned for that international appeal, and is important.
And it helps set the stage for reviewers. This goes back to how your work is going to be reviewed as well. Reviewers, when they read that paragraph, are told right from the outset, what is it that these authors are trying to do in this particular manuscript? What do they want us to learn? It's important. Say it, by golly. It'll also help you write the rest of the paper if you say it well.
So the next is a big one again for us. I know we're saying they're all big, and they really are. No subjects allowed.
Yes, no subjects allowed. A lot of psychological studies, and it's one discipline of psychology, introduced the term subjects, and they were, I think, thinking of rats running through mazes. The term subject is not allowed in our journal. I mean, obviously you write on different subjects, but the term subject, as used by psychologists, which really refers to participants, is not allowed in our journal. We want you to refer to people with whom you're working as participants. People who give of their time and their effort to tell you things that you need to learn in order to do your study should never be called subhuman, unworthy of respect. Try using the term that anthropologists use. Try participant or informant. And in a sense, anybody who tells you anything is a key informant. I don't like the term key informant either, but that's, again, just my own craziness. But I will not publish a manuscript that uses subjects to refer to people who have provided information. We take the position that calling women subjects is degrading and anti-feminist. So please just choose another word. Easy to edit if you've written subjects. Easy to edit if your mentor told you these are your, who are your subjects. Just edit it for publication. You can select all the times that word appears and substitute informant or participant.
So the next is, we're talking about style for our journal, and this is a style that is sort of created at a broader level than us. We, for example, use the 6th edition of the APA manual and handbook. So if I get an article and I see that I quickly see the references aren't in APA style or the headings are wrong, it's not going to go any further. Now, that's not to say I have a ruler out and I'm measuring the same way that folks did when you turned in your dissertation to make sure everything looked the right way. But I'm in general looking to see, did you follow APA? Are you meeting our needs, our standards? But I will sort of warn you a caveat that the editor reserves the right to modify these guidelines from time to time. Certainly we know that it's not a one-size-fits-all situation, and there are times that we have to make allowances or make changes. I know one example of that would be footnotes that I can remember having to make an allowance for. So follow the style guideline that the editor tells you to follow with some mind of what actually appears in the journal. And if it seems confusing or if you're in doubt, I reach out and ask the editor. It's a simple one.
We're asked a lot about page length and word length. So we've put in this workshop that most manuscripts are not greater than 6,500 words, including references. But then we can't leave it at that, and we tell you longer manuscripts, sometimes close to 10,000 words, are accepted when appropriate in relation to research design. We don't have one of those hard and fast rules, but you should always be looking at that, because some journals do. Some journals say that their limit is 6,500 words, and if there's 6,501 words, your work will be rejected. Ours is not that hard, but it does matter, and authors and certainly reviewers are always told to consider whether the manuscripts could or should be shortened, and if they can be, they probably should be. There are some manuscripts that we get that should really be reduced to brief research reports, rather than full articles. So journal space, despite the fact that there are many more journals in existence, is at a premium. And if you want your work to get in, and you want your colleagues' work to get in, you need to be as brief as you can.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly if you submit a 40-page manuscript, you're going to have to really, really work hard to make the case that every page of those 40 pages makes the grade and matters, because submitting something that long, I think you are throwing up a barrier yourself to being published. It's harder to find the space for something that long. And we are asking as editors, and the reviewers are asking, do we need all this? Is it necessary? There are plenty of times where reviewers will say more here, or I'd like a table, or I need more details. And I'm guessing that for most authors, it's pretty easy to go back and add in. But sending something that's just excessively long, I think, think to when you grade papers. You get something supposed to be a 5-page assignment,
my eyes, yeah.
and somebody submits 15 pages, and just the the sort of torture of reading it. Think along those lines, because there are people that are volunteering to read your work.
And one of the quickest ways to shorten a manuscript is often to reduce the number of references. And some people are going to shudder as I say that. But one doesn't have to cite every study that was ever published in your work. One needs to be able to find the general gist of a theoretical argument, because what you're doing is taking your place in a world of science. You want to fit your work in. So you can say several researchers have studied C, for example, and not provide the entire list. You can say, more references can be sent to interested readers, upon request. And that's enough, but I mean, you might get a reviewer reading your work who gets upset because you didn't cite their particular work, but you have to pick and choose. You don't need to include every single study. This isn't an inclusive literature review like you had to produce when you were writing a dissertation at one time, or when you were writing a request for funding for a particular grant money. This is a journal article, and you just have to set the tone, putting your work in perspective in the world of science that came before you and will go on after you.
So we talked about contributing to knowledge about women and health, and we have listed here 6 ways, for example, that you can do that with our journal. And when talking about our journal and other journals as well, I think it's also important to take a look. We talked about that constant comparison analysis. Take a look at what special issues they offer. Do they offer them regularly? For example, we offer every year a special issue on aging. But beyond special issues, we publish journal issues that are thematic. In other words, you'll pick up an issue and you'll find 5 papers that all are about violence in some way. Or recently we published an issue on matters about weight loss and weight loss surgery, and there was even one about marketing towards that particular surgery. So a very big umbrella, but looking at those themes and those special issues will help you determine ways that you can contribute, or examples of ways you can contribute.
And there may be somebody out here in this audience who has in mind a theme for a special issue that might be suitable for Healthcare for Women International. And if you have an idea for such a theme, don't be hesitant to contact the editor, because we might consider it. We might even make you a guest editor for that issue. So if you're willing to put together an issue like that, it's possible. We've done special issues on recreational therapy. We've done special issues that had to do with a particular part of the globe. We had health issues about women who happen to be on the African continent. And we'd love to do a special issue on health issues affecting women in South America or women in different parts of Asia. We can do that. But, we need your help to do it. The main thing is to know something about the history of our journal. Our journal began as a mama-baby journal. And for a long time, it was about what I call reproductive reductionism. And reproduction and women's women's role in the reproductive process, their wombs, are still very important to us. However, that's not all we consider. We study the digestive system and the circulatory system, and we study policies related to all aspects of women's health. So, take a look at us and take a look at other journals and place your work where you think you will find the best fit.
So we also have a literature review policy, and I'll advise you that I don't believe that most journals have a written policy like what we do, but I would say it's a safe bet to assume that theirs follows in the general scope or the general scheme of ours. I'll tell you, it's a high bar for publishing a literature review in our journal and in most journals. Space is at a premium, and making that contribution for a lit review, you really have to work hard to convince us that you have made that contribution.
You do. In the course of a year, we publish about 100 papers, and maybe we'll publish 2 literature reviews in an entire year. People often ask me, can they publish the literature review of their dissertation? And the answer is Probably not. When you were doing a dissertation, first of all, you had a different audience, and I keep telling you, audience, audience, audience. Then your audience was the group of people who were on some committee, or who were going to look at your work, and they were interested in that time seeing whether you deserved to enter the world of science at all. Did you know the literature? And you had to include quite a bit. You perhaps did make a theoretical contribution in that literature, but probably you were talking about all the different kinds of theories that might have been addressed in that literature. We're asking you to perhaps make a theoretical contribution by doing a kind of continuous comparative analysis of all the literature that exists and coming up with something new, a new way of looking at that particular social issue after doing the literature review. And what's the theoretical contribution wouldn't already exist in the literature. Or we're asking you to make a methodological contribution. Did you do some review of literature differently than other people do a review of literature? How did you choose what you reviewed? Is it different from the way people ordinarily choose it? That's what it would have to be if you're making a methodological contribution. Or you could provide a summary, substantively, of what you found, but your summary would have to include information that's not already there. That nobody's ever done a summary, that there's a literature here, literature there, and nobody knows anything because they've never put all the pieces together. If that's really true, then perhaps we'll consider your literature review. But it's certainly not a common thing in a literature review, and it's almost never the literature review that you did for a dissertation. A little bit more of a chance if it's a literature review that was done for a grant proposal, because in a grant proposal you tend to be moving more in that direction. But you know what a theoretical contribution is. You know what a methodological contribution is, and you know what providing information is that's not already there. You just can't summarize what everybody has already said. Even if it's sometimes I get literature reviews that are summaries of what has been said in a particular country, and the author will tell me, well, nobody knows about the literature in Brazil, in your country. If that's the case, then you're going to have to tell me why we don't know and why we should know, and what about this literature in Brazil is different from the literature that might exist in our country. That would be new information, and that we might consider.
So I think just to wrap up this presentation, we're going to talk about how to submit work and then how the review process and getting that feedback works. So we, as most journals do, have an online submission platform. We use Manuscript Central, and to submit your work, you have to submit it electronically, so it needs to be in Microsoft Word. Our particular software turns it into PDF, so we prefer you start off in Word. A big one is to blind the document you label main document. It's a huge problem. It slows down the process if you submit this great work, but your name's all over it. And when we say blind, I mean make sure it's not on the cover sheet, the title page, but also don't refer to the fact that this is part of a previous study and then reference the study, because then there you've provided your name.
Yeah. Authors make a lot of mistakes when blinding. Sometimes you have to take out the name of the institution within the manuscript where something was done, because if there are only two faculty in gerontology at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, and you say this study was done at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, you've pretty much identified the names of the people, even if you haven't used them. So the word blind is an interesting one. We don't mean, take your eyes out. We literally mean take out information that would identify the authors of the study. Anything that would identify the authors of the study needs to come out in the main document.
And you can do this easily, I'll just say, by either using the highlight feature in Word and making it black highlighting, or you can remove the words and put a placeholder, remove for blinded peer review, and you'll notice substitute it back in. The next two are essentially don't double dip. You have to certify the work hasn't been submitted anywhere else and that it hasn't been published anywhere else, because of course we all know that's unethical. And for us...
Well, wait a minute. some open access journals allow people to do that now. It's unethical in traditional peer-reviewed journals such as ours. And we feel that some of the open access journals are unethical because people are submitting more places than once. Keep in mind that we do not charge a submission fee. Many journals charge a submission fee. Our peer reviewers don't get paid a nickel for reviewing your manuscript. And one of the reasons that we say it's unethical is we think it's unethical for our peer reviewers to be asked to review the same manuscript in more than one place. Because there's a limited number of experts in subject matter, sometimes that has happened. Sometimes we've learned that an author is double dipped because a reviewer has told us, I just reviewed the same manuscript for such and such a journal. And I wrote that it should be rejected then, and I still think it should be rejected. Believe it or not, it's a relatively small world. Don't double dip. We think it's unethical for our own reasons. You shouldn't do it. We ask you not to do it, and you're really making people work much too hard.
And then for us, we also ask that you certify that you followed our tips. And by certifying that you have, you understand that you will be rejected out of hand, which I know I mentioned several times, for not following them. So once you submit a manuscript, a bunch of things happen. Actually, quite a bit of things happen behind the scenes that you never see. Quite a lot of time is invested into your paper and evaluating it by the editor, by the managing editor, by reviewers. So once it's submitted to the system, you are assigned a number. Use that number every time you ask anyone a question about your paper. Use the number. It saves time. You'll get an email straight away saying that your paper has been received. From there, with us, your paper is internally reviewed. So that basically means that I'm looking at it to see, did you meet our style guidelines? Does it meet our scope? Does it fit? For example, if I got a paper that focused solely on men and their experience with vasectomies, I would think, nope, see you later, it doesn't apply. I'm sure you could convince me somehow in a discussion that it had to do with women's health, but I'm looking at those big sort of broad things. From there, we determine at least two, depends on what your paper is about and what you've submitted, two peer reviewers that are experts in either those methods or that subject area. The peer reviewers submit their reviews, and once they're submitted, we take a look at those reviews and we sort of evaluate them. What are they saying? Are they saying the same things? If they are, we synthesize your review comments. So in other words, 3 people may have looked at your work, an internal reviewer and 2 peer reviewers, but you may only get one long list of comments. If they were similar in nature, we're not just going to be repetitive.
We're doing this for a variety of reasons. We say we perform double blind review. That means that the author doesn't know who the peer reviewers are, and the peer reviewers don't know who the authors are. Sometimes the field of research is relatively small, and it's a means of making the reviewers tougher to identify. If we take the comments of reviewer A and reviewer B, and we put them together when they're the same, the initial reviewer is less identifiable. There are times when we don't do that. If we get 2 conflicting reviews where one reviewer loves the work and the other reviewer doesn't, in that instance we won't synthesize. We'll make sure you know that the reviews of your manuscript were contradictory. And in that instance, you will definitely get more comments by the editors as well. And you'll know which is which, and we will tell you what to do.
And I want to say to you as well, when you get that initial email, at least for us, there's also a clue in it about timing. For example, I get lots of papers submitted, or we see a peak in submissions on holidays, academic holidays, because you're not teaching at the moment and you have time to write. Well, the reviewers are doing the same thing likely, or they're on holiday themselves and don't want to deal with any of this. So it's not an ideal time to ask reviewers to review papers. So you'll get a note saying, usually for us, we say the entire process takes about 3 months. We love it when it's quicker. We hate it for you, and we hate it ourselves when it drags on, but sometimes we just can't do anything about that. We're dependent on their schedules.
And we always need reviewers. Another tip for publishing success that isn't on my list that you should avail yourself of is to become a reviewer yourself. One of the best ways to do the continuous comparative analysis I'm talking about is to sign up to be a reviewer for 2 or 3 journals that you think you might eventually want to publish your work in, because you will learn by being a peer reviewer what the style of that journal really is. You will really learn how to, what one accepts and what one does not accept.
So once we've synthesized the review comments, you'll get an email detailing the results. You'll get a decision. Does your work need to be revised and resubmitted and peer reviewed again? Is it accepted pending minor revisions? Is it rejected? No matter what we ask you to do, and no matter what journal, this is, I think, a universal tip, it helps in that resubmission process if you submit a list or a table even of reviewer comments and how you address them. That way our reviewers know, hey, this author really considered what I had to say. They're not being ignored. And honestly, you're making their job easier. You're saying, if a reviewer says, I want more information about how you selected your participants, then the author can come back and say, I added a paragraph on page 7, and the paragraph is highlighted and easy to find. I think it makes the job smoother. I think, frankly, you're more likely to be accepted.
We now expect this in our particular journal. We want you to address what the reviewers say. If you don't think that what the reviewer suggested is a good idea, you can say that. But you cannot, but you may not ignore what they say. Because if you do, again, it becomes a stylistic problem. You just haven't listened. The reviewers may not always be right. I'm not saying the reviewer is always better than you. In fact, they may not be. But they've taken their time to read your work and to make suggestions for how your work could be improved. At least address what they've said.
So, as we've said several times throughout this presentation, when you're in doubt, email the editors. That's what we're here for. We're here to answer questions. But in terms of emailing us, I mentioned on the last slide you get a manuscript number. Including that makes my job so much simpler. If I only have a very few minutes in the middle of my day to answer your message, if you've given me that number, I can quickly find your file in the system and answer you instead of having to search based on part of your name or part of your title. I'll say as well, be as specific and as brief as possible. Being polite and understanding that we can't always control the process and the timing of the process, rather, goes a long way. We do the best we can, and reviewers certainly know that everybody is sort of eagerly awaiting results. But it's a lot to ask of people to do. So being patient and being kind, I think, with everything in life, never hurts. So here's our contact information. If you have questions specific to this presentation, as Ellie mentioned, if you'll email them to us during the Congress, we will be glad to answer them. Moving forward, if you have a question about publication in our journal, please definitely feel free to reach out to us. It's a common practice to get an email with an abstract in it and say, do you think this work fits? Sometimes we can tell enough from your abstract, sometimes we can't. But again, if you're polite and succinct, it never hurts to ask.
That's right. We do read the abstracts. Please do not submit whole manuscripts, however, and expect us to read those. I want to close by saying, bon fortune, good luck, mazel tov. I want you to be successful. I want you all to enter the world of science if your work is not already published in the literature. If your work is already published in the literature, I want you to continue to contribute. I want you to help us to continue to make Health Cares for Women International the best journal it can possibly be. I want women's health opportunities to improve all over the globe. Good luck and goodbye.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your conference.